Hi, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech, week three. As always, I'm joined here by my colleague, Charlie Araujo, and we're here to take on the biggest issues happening in enterprise tech today. So I'll start with probably the most interesting article that we both saw that is raised some hackles and brought up some feelings, so to speak. And that's that we saw the register's take on the city of Birmingham trying to move over from SAP to Oracle. And apparently, this has been a somewhat problematic change as they have gone way over budget. They were promised one thing and then done another. And right now, it seems to actually be literally bankrupting the city as we speak. So, of course, Charlie, I know you do a lot of work with both digital transformation and modernization. And I was wondering how this project felt in terms of what projects you've worked with and clients you've worked with.
Well, first we should clarify this is the city of Birmingham in the UK, not in
Yes.
Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Alabama,
don't have,
Birmingham's just fine as far as I know. Yes.
yeah, they're doing great, at least we think, right? And what I was struck by is a few things. Obviously, I don't have any inside knowledge of exactly what precipitated this move, but by everything that it's in the article, it would seem like it's just this idea of promised cost savings. They're moving from one legacy set, SAP, to, well, Oracle probably wouldn't call this, I would argue, to another legacy, right? Oracle's system, of course, they're supposed to be the Oracle Cloud and what have you. But, I sit here and I scratch my head in this day and age and say, why why are they spending their energy here? And it speaks to all the reasons why, when we were off camera, you said that you're sure that somebody called this a digital transformation, and I'm sure you're right. I think this is absolutely not digital transformation. This is at best a technology project, at worst a completely unnecessary technology project that some sales guy made a bunch of money for selling onto this idea of cost savings. And the question, if I'm a CIO today that I'm asking for anything I'm doing is, how is this creating competitive advantage for my organization? And nothing in that article spoke to that in any way, shape, or form. And it's like, it just stinks of old school mentalities about it. As you said, probably wrapped in the veneer of digital transformation, and we see the results. I mean, there's just so much that I'm sure, and I feel like I don't want to pile on to these poor guys because they're just. I mean, I think the numbers where it started, it was supposed to be like a $20 million savings, and they're now in at 180 million in US dollars or something. I mean, just
Right.
staggering numbers, and it's just like I cannot believe we're having these conversations still in this day and age.
Yeah, and I feel like the trap that they fell into, it's actually a somewhat common one that companies think we've reached a certain size and we've have a certain amount of bespoke customization, but if we just move into this other platform, all the problems will be solved because this other platform is supposed to be so much better or easier to use. From a practical perspective, I don't think I've ever seen this really work. If you've got a very customized SAP or Oracle or Workday or Salesforce or what have you, enterprise application suite, it's probably bespoke for a reason, and those reasons don't just go away because you want to use a different technology.
Well, or it may be bespoke for a reason. I mean, I think this is the thing. I had this conversation, this argument really with, I don't remember who it was actually, not too long ago, about the fact that, this idea that out of the box processes and business processes work, and that, that you shouldn't be doing the customization. And I think it's a very fine line. I mean, I think to a certain extent, there are some elements of any business. Every business is in fact unique. Every business serves its own unique market. In this case, a government serves its own constituencies, has its own way of operating, and there's parts of that that do require some degree of customization. Um,
Mhm.
However, I have spent so many years and so many hours working on so many projects where it becomes really clear that most of these customizations are just about the fact that the organization somewhere, somehow, some way, somebody decided that this is how it should be done. for no good reason. And most importantly, for a reason that adds no value to the organization other than the fact that that's how they work. That's how they've always done it.
Mhm.
And so to me, the big fallacy here is that if you're going to go through the headache and the heartache of making a transition, that you need to become brutally honest with asking yourself if any ounce of energy put forward in the effort of quote unquote customization is worth it. Is it going to pay off? And force people to answer for that, that it's going to quantify it, that making this customization is going to cost this much money. Show me the ROI on that change, right?
Mhm.
Or is it in fact easier to change the way we work rather than to change the system to try to do this? And I think we've seen systems between cost overruns and just, not for money, but delay and time. And but the biggest issue is that it's taking the attention away from where it should be. And it's like, how am I creating, if I'm a city of Birmingham, a better um, constituent experience? How am I delivering better services for my citizens? Is any of this doing that? And I have to believe the answer is no. And so, that's really where what just irks the heck out of me when I read stories like this. Um, in addition to just, the mismanagement and whatever. And I get it's hard. I get it's hard, and I get that they probably had some overselling and a bunch of other stuff, but it just really bothers me.
Yeah, government work can be challenging, and not just because one of the cliches of how government may or may not be better than the business world, but you have a bunch of people making decisions who are elected on whatever it is, a 2 year, 4 year, 5 year, 6 year basis. And if the public doesn't like you, you're gone. But you might have been the council's expert on technology, and whether you get voted in or out is often dependent on whether you were good at fixing potholes or whether you understood healthcare or some other issue that is completely different from understanding the technology associated with what you're working with. So these municipal and other governmental agencies and organizations always have that specific problem. But one of the details in this article that got me is that the council is spending an extra $5 million on manual workarounds right now in the middle of this technology advancement, meaning they just couldn't figure out how to actually get things done within this superior software. And this actually is not a ding on Oracle, because I just think every company does things that are complicated. Every organization does things that are complicated. But the issue is that somebody's job was to document how this was done at a step-by-step basis that could be transferable, and it just didn't happen,
Well,
obviously.
and so absolutely, I agree. And look, I think that there's more than anything. What this points out to me is that even in the blocking and tackling, this is where organizations that are smart are looking at a handful of things, right? One is we're in this era now of low code, no code tools and low code, no code interfaces, right? So increasingly, I am looking at any organization that requires that customization to take place in the form of code with a skeptical eye, because that inherently introduces layers of complication. Whereas if I can do this through quote unquote configuration, right, a graphical interface that allows me to customize, to create those business processes and the flows that I need, that I think starts changing things dramatically. Second thing, I think it really, to me, it shines a spotlight on why things like process mining and task mining are so absolutely critical. So I'm a huge fan of what Celonis, but there's a number of places, ironically enough, Signavio, on the SAP side themselves, right? They acquired Signavio that does this, that they go and actually pull application logs to find out exactly how these processes are actually working, not what somebody, what almost always happens is somebody had a nice process map someplace and said, this is what we're designing the to be state based on. And it had absolutely no relation to the reality of how they were actually operating under the covers. And likewise, the task mining idea of, and so in the case of SAP, they partnered with a company called Noah, but there's a whole bunch of Celonis also has task mining, so a whole bunch of them out there that allow you to take a look at a specific user and say, how are they executing one of these steps within the process to understand what's really happening? And these are the things that get you, right? If you're going to make, and it's not even just about migration, right? I mean, like in Noah's case, I've known them for a long time, and most of their work was in people upgrading within the SAP
Right.
ecosystem. So that's
Mhm.
like just going up to HANA S4 and what have you. And so, there's so much to be gained by actually recognizing that the reality of how this stuff works is much more complex than they probably think, and being able to dig under the covers. And you're right, that manual workaround piece was like a red flag that said this clearly there is a huge miss here. So yeah, it speaks to how complex technology really is. And if you truly are going to be doing something true digital transformation, it's going to be even harder than this, because you're going to be breaking things. And so, yeah, it's tough, and that's why people don't do it, I guess. But yeah, this was a shocking one as I'm reading it.
Yeah, and I think this also speaks to how even the likes of SAP and Oracle and Microsoft have to admit that transformation goes beyond their own platform. So to make these changes work, you've got to think about your entire really hardware and software ecosystem as part of this problem, which is why SAP and Oracle have been uh, investing so much in things like IT management, just understanding what other assets and resources are out there, the project management aspects to understand how to budget and take care of these contingent labor and contingent project issues that are happening. They all see this coming up over and over and over again as a barrier to their own ability to pick business or to upgrade their own customers. And of course, like SAP, they've wanted to upgrade everybody to S4HANA for over a decade now and are still struggling to do it, but partially because why do an upgrade that seems unnecessary or often honestly is unnecessary to your business?
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's interesting. So some of the other news that was out was Salesforce's latest
Mhm.
earnings, and I think we see some of the same thing reflected there, right? If you
Right.
look at where their growth is, we're seeing, and it's hard. I mean, some of this may just be the hangover from the pandemic, because obviously their growth numbers were off the charts during the pandemic. But you look at this, and we're seeing, I mean, look, they're still growing, so it's not flat, but lower levels of growth in the sales and the marketing and the service, right? The
Mhm.
blocking and tackling stuff, and
Right.
high levels of growth in data and the MuleSoft piece, the Cloud Tableau space, right? Things that are a little bit more about how do you move the business forward. And I think we're going to continue to see this shift where, we've been talking obviously on the show for the last few episodes a lot about generative AI, create massive force around momentum. And so it starts, I think, shifting priority. So I'm curious how you read those numbers out of Salesforce.
So I continue to be really impressed with how Salesforce is selling Tableau and MuleSoft, basically application integration and business intelligence visualization and the emerging AI capabilities that they have there. There continues to be a need to simply understand what the heck is going on in your organization. And as Salesforce has been really banging the drum and showing companies just how many apps are really out there and how big the data integration challenge is. They've been winning business from a lot of the traditional data integration, application integration, and analytics players. So whether you think about a MicroStrategy or an Informatica, those, or a SaaS, companies that have traditionally made their $1 billion a year just doing data. Salesforce is able to come in, kind of do an end run around IT and go directly to the sales and marketing people and tell them about data problems, and then just happen to have a solution that the sales and marketing people can push to IT that is good enough to buy. So Salesforce is doing a great job of saying data is really important, selling to a different audience, and then ultimately still making IT do the job of making it all work.
I don't know if I'm supposed to admit this as an analyst, but I missed this one. Like, I was way off the mark when the MuleSoft acquisition in particular took
Mhm.
place. I was scratching my head going, I don't understand this. I have no idea why they'd be making this buy.
Mhm.
And I was way off on it, because I think and what's ironic is I've been beating the data is the center of everything drum forever. And yet, dummy me, it's like, oh, well, then that means if you're a Salesforce, then you better own that data hub. You better own that data center. And for me in particular, because I didn't see MuleSoft as being horribly progressive, right? They were part of an
Mhm.
older generation of it. But I think they've done a really good job of using it as an anchor to sort of reposition really the entire company, and really kind of help that transition of looking at Salesforce as more than just the CRM player. And I think that has been a really smart play. Tableau, I think to a lesser degree, but as well, this idea of well, once you have this data, then how do you visualize it and become the central hub for all of it? So it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing higher levels of growth there. I think that's indicative of both where the entire market is going and the fact that this is sort of central to their new strategy. And like I said, these are sort of the central parts that are propelling the entire market forward right now as organizations are asking themselves how they can start leveraging this data to create advantage. And so it sort of opens up that door.
Yeah, but I think, Charlie, your questions back in the acquisition time were honestly made a lot of sense. Whether Salesforce could actually execute on a strategy of selling enterprise data services to the enterprise world was a real question. Of course, they had one huge customer data platform that everybody knew about, from sales, service, and marketing. Like, everybody knew that data was there, but whether they could translate that into a real IT centric data cell was a huge question that was really unknown. And when you saw Salesforce's pitch at the time, it's still very much about no software, support your salespeople, support your marketing people, support the line of business that it supports sales. That was the revenue. That was really their story. So the fact that they were able to get this more general story that is more around the digital enterprise as a whole and actually make it stick to the tune of 20% year over year growth is impressive. And I think we sometimes get, especially a couple of years ago, we got used to seeing these growth numbers that were gigantic, 30%, 40%, 50%, and started to maybe take that for granted. But let's be honest, 20% growth year over year is still a lot. Like,
Well, especially with these kind of numbers. I mean, they're such a big company now anyway. I mean, that kind of growth number is just crazy in
mhm.
general. But it also leads to another story, and I think these all sort of go hand in hand as far as where we're seeing these investments, where people are putting their attention.
Mhm.
One of the things that's interesting is that something that I've been watching a bit is we went through this whole era of shadow IT rising, of really Salesforce, I would argue, introduced the entire concept, right? Where it's like, you don't need IT, just go use your credit card, buy Salesforce, enable your sales team, use their CRM, forget IT, right? And that was like the
Mhm.
beginnings, right, of this whole movement around we don't need IT, just go buy what you need and go
Right.
do this. And what is interesting is this MuleSoft acquisition was ironically sort of an inadvertent statement that people realized that IT still had a very, very critical role to play. The CIO in
Mhm.
particular had a critical role to play because as this data became more important, as it became more widespread, a CRO doesn't want to be dealing with all of that. They want to go be driving revenue. They want to be driving sales. And so the CIO we've seen this sort of come back where it's leveled out. And I think the smart CIOs have stopped, putting up this wall going, you can't, but instead have said, hey, I can, here's how we can help enable all of this. And so I think you're seeing that in the numbers there at Salesforce. It also is reflected in an article, I think it was a New York, no, Wall Street Journal. How not only are we seeing the push from Nvidia, all of the numbers there being driven by the big data centers, but we're also seeing increasing revenue being driven at least indirectly because CIOs are now putting so much specific funding into AI initiatives. And what I find fascinating about it is in that article, one of the quotes, I think it was from the CIO from Eli Lilly, he talked
Mhm.
about how he went into a meeting asking for X and came out of the meeting with 2X budget. And it's like, that's unheard of, right? Where you're, no. You're not asking for enough. Let us give you twice as much money. And the reason is they were allocating a huge chunk of that directly to these AI initiatives. And
Mhm.
what's interesting is that wasn't directly in the IT budget, but it was in a specific budget and that's what this article is about. They're creating specific AI budgets that the CIO controls, but independent of the traditional spend. And what I think is interesting is what is indicative to me of is that we're seeing that this is now becoming so critical across all aspects of this AI, data, core infrastructure, how we execute, that the role is shifting and the role of the CIO is becoming even more important in that. And I think like going all the way back, it we see it reflected in both these other stories we're talking about, right? Where it goes bad, i.e. Birmingham, and where they're making the right or the smart sort of investments in some of the sales data we're seeing out of Salesforce, right? That kind of shift. And so I think it's this interesting kind of period of time where, frankly, the rules are just all changing.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the CIOs, the necessity for the CIO to differentiate between core and strategic spend. As simple as that sounds, I think that Birmingham project is a great example of where those two got blended together, and somebody decided that core was strategy. And but on the other hand, AI does require specific new investments, whether you're talking about even just looking back at your data and documenting your metadata, or understanding how you're supposed to build models, how to do data science. If you didn't invest in data science in the last round of AI, which, honestly, for a lot of companies, that wasn't a core capability then. But now you need to own your AI, or else you're going to really lose control of your own processes and data to an extent that wasn't true with the predictive AI capabilities that just kind of gave you some sort of output based on some sort of very specific forecast. And there wasn't that much to lose from a control and governance perspective. Now with these generative AI solutions, we have a different type of problem where you type in a prompt and you might be able to actually socially engineer your way into getting information that you shouldn't be able to if the model and the generative AI infrastructure isn't set up correctly. So yeah, there's a lot more to invest in now. And fortunately, executives have bought into the idea that this is a different type of computing and a different type of infrastructure that has to be put into place. So I think it's good that that budget exists. But I think it also speaks to that fundamental need for CIOs to have that at least two-tiered, if not more tiered approach to budget. That really has to be in place, and don't get confused about what is strategic, what is innovative, and versus what is core and keeping the lights on.
Yeah, and I feel bad. I mean, I hope I never meet anyone from the city of Birmingham, UK, because I feel bad like we're like piling on with them. But I look at that and that's it. I mean, that this project has sucked the air, not like you said, not only is it potentially bankrupt the entire city, but it sucked the air out of there's no conversation about strategic anything, about innovating for the constituencies, right? They're now in pure survival mode. And I think it does speak to the fact that, I mean, I talk a lot about managing the IT tech estate in these two buckets. I call it the efficiency estate and the innovation estate, that you have to be segregating these out. When I wrote my first book, I interviewed a CIO by the name of Ashwin Rangani. He's now the CIO for ICANN. And he talked about how at the time he was working with Edwards Life Sciences and how he negotiated a slug, a bucket of money that was used to keep the lights on. And that was all about driving cost out. It was about efficiency and optimization. And then there were all the budgets that were stacked on top of that. And that was about things that were going to drive business growth and innovation and moving the business forward. And I think it is so imperative to manage these distinctly, because if you don't, then we get these sort of situations. And I think that's what you're seeing, is that the CIOs that understand that today, they're poised and positioned to really ride this wave. And hopefully, if they've, I mean, you still have to execute, going all the way back to like even what we're talking about the MuleSoft thing, you still have to execute. But if they have built that executional model, then they're poised to really start taking advantage of this. And I think we're going to see a really strong delineation, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years of those execs. They get it and are doing those things and are truly leading the organizations forward, and those that are just the caretakers and they're focused on these migrations, and they don't get that there's this whole other thing that they should be focusing their time on instead.
Yeah, and one of the things I saw last week that really reminded me of that shift is in Snowflake announcing that they're having a new CEO, Frank Slotman, who has led their meteoric growth for many years. After also doing the same thing at ServiceNow, is stepping down as CEO, and he basically said as he was stepping down, one of the reasons is that the core business of Snowflake as a data warehouse, something they've done very fantastically for structured data and for supporting analytics, is starting to slow down a little bit. They're down to 30% growth, which is still amazing growth, but they've had expectations of 70, 80, 100% growth, which is unsustainable. But they realize that to get to the next level, they need to understand AI. And so they brought the CEO of their Neeva acquisition, their search acquisition, Sridhar Ramaswamy, in to become the CEO. And in doing so, it shows they see the need to move from the ultimate sales guy, the ultimate operations guy, the bull in a china shop who would make it happen no matter what, Frank Slotman. They said, we need somebody different. We need somebody who's more of a technologist, someone who can be kind of a change agent from the technology side to move forward. And it adds another Indian Institute of Technology CEO to the big tech mix, where IIT is definitely having a moment with all the executives they have at the top slots now. So, it's interesting to see one of these, big enterprise companies trying to make that same shift over to AI and, of course, support CIO projects going forward.
Yeah, I mean, what most impressed me about it is it represented a sign of maturity. I think we often see in these tech companies a degree of hubris and this sense of holding on. I think we know some who we're talking about maybe, and I think ultimately that ends up leading to stagnation. It may be a long time. It may, company may be very, very big by the time you get there, but it often leads to stagnation because it is this is a crazy industry. It changes so fast and the needs are always different. I think ServiceNow is a great example of an organization that has done that very well. They have brought in the right CEOs and the right leadership teams at the right times for their different periods of growth to accelerate that growth. And I think what is ironic, if I look at ServiceNow as an example of that, and I think Snowflake is another good example of that, is that when that happens, you not only see an organization that is growing at this meteoric pace, but one that is able to maintain its culture, one that is able to have a positive impact on the industry, and you end up sort of not getting some of those more negative elements that often happen when you don't see that leadership change. And so, to me, I think it's a very positive sign for Snowflake. I think that it will bode well for them. And actually, to me, this is going to be like a really weird segue probably, but going all the way back to the challenge with the CIO, I think that one of the challenges for a CIO today is dealing with actually two things that are very related to what Snowflake is dealing with. One is there's a massive challenge within the average, the typical enterprise right now in succession planning, and how do you develop the next round of leadership? And the second round is how do you deal with innovation? How do you place bets and how do you make it? And so one non-enterprise, but big news this week, because it was kind of a slow news week, right? One of big news this week that wasn't related to the enterprise directly is Apple, leaking that Apple's killed their electric vehicle program, which they never admitted to existing anyway, but that they killed it. And most of the news out there was bad. Most of the news out there was like the Apple's rare loss, right? They spent billions on this and got nowhere. And there was this one article in the New York Times that I thought was really interesting because it talked about that people are looking at this incorrectly. That while this was ultimately not a product they brought to market, that a couple of things. One, they evaluated it properly. They looked at this after making this investment and decided that it did not make sense to continue investing in it. They didn't follow the sunk money problem that many organizations fall into, that trap where they just pursue it anyway because they put too much money into it. They were brave enough or courageous enough to say, we're going to pull the plug on this. This doesn't make sense. But secondly, because it was, and this is the same thing Google is famous for, right? The moonshot projects, right? That the value is not always, in fact, often not in the result that you think that the project is supposedly aiming for, but the value is in all the innovation mindset that it creates within the organization. And so this article pointed out to all the innovation that came out of this electric vehicle project that spread
Mhm.
throughout the entire organization. And so when I was reading that as a CIO, I'm thinking like, yeah, those are the kind of things you need to be taking some calculated risks where you're making these investments and you're taking these shots, not even because it's going to necessarily work or that it's going to necessarily be right, but it's going to reset your organization into this innovation mindset. And it's going to set you up to develop the next round of leadership. It's going to set you up for figuring out how to take advantage of these new technologies, all these different things that happen. And if it happens to work, well, that's the gravy, frankly. And so I thought it was a really interesting lesson, particularly because I think so many people sort of missed it.
Yeah, and I think it can be hard for executives if you're a CIO, CTO, asking for innovation budget. But Apple, having $250 billion cash on hand, knows that they should take a few big bets every once in a while. Microsoft as well. I find it a bit ironic that although we know moonshots best from Google, and Google's had a couple of big shots like Google Maps. I really think of Apple and Microsoft as the two companies that have really done a great job of taking big leaps and bringing out things like the Microsoft Xbox or Apple TV, like things that are outside of their core capability, but they realized were important to building out the next kind of layer of their ecosystem if they wanted to be true global forces. So, but it's hard to sometimes uh, go outside of that core and say, yes, are we willing to lose 1% of our cash on hand, or 1 or 2% of our asset value for this bet? Um,
Well,
that's yeah.
well, one of the things that you said something I think is really, really important, and that is that I think where a lot of organizations, particularly in the traditional enterprise and the CIO, struggle with this is that it's really hard to go out and like set up a quote unquote innovation office, which is where people always
Mhm.
want to start, right? Let's go set up this ivory tower to think about these big ideas. That's really hard to justify, right?
Mhm.
But if you look at what Apple did, you look at these moonshot projects. These are defined efforts, and those are a lot easier to sell, right? So if you're within an enterprise, go establish a project team where you do have a controlled risk amount of budget that you assign to with, and give it a specific goal and objective, this sort of moonshot
Mhm.
orientation, but go into it understanding that your metrics are not just does it succeed, because that sets up the wrong idea. The metrics are you building leadership? Are you building pipeline into for your for your senior leadership team? Are you building pipeline into other innovations that are going to drive elsewhere, right? And so selecting that gives you the ability. I remember I, I was younger and I was working with a Fortune 500 company, and one of the senior execs would fly me to Ohio once a month to meet with them.
Mhm.
And I remember I was so proud of myself, patting myself on the back about, oh my gosh, I must be so smart. He's spending all this money to fly me out just to talk with me.
Mhm.
But I realized is exactly the problem you're talking about. He couldn't put on his calendar time to think, but he could put on his calendar that he had an entire day set aside to work with me. And what did we do? We just talked about ideas. It gave him time to think in a way that he could justify in the corporate world. And I think it's the exact same thing that we're talking about here is how do you establish these programs so you can create opportunities to innovate that are within the bounds of how the organization works.
Yes, and I think another piece is that it can be easy to put out 100 experiments the way that Google does. Google has these Google Labs where they have every product under the sun in some level of alpha or beta, but it's hard to push your chips into big bets and actually try to make them work for good or for bad. And I think that's an area where a lot of companies can stand to improve. Going past that initial proof of concept or that one little project you have in the cloud and actually pushing in the chips and making the big bets at the end of the day. Like, is it possible to make a big bet in your organization, even if everything is well aligned and you have the resources defined and you have the people in place and everything else? Can you actually move forward with doing something that is important. Because even even Apple can fail, but they succeed more often than they fail because they have a smart way of being able to go through innovative projects for their, everything from their headsets to their games to their TV to everything else that is part of this whole ecosystem that they have.
Yeah, at the risk of sounding like an Apple fanboy, which I admittedly am, I think one of Apple's great strengths is from a cultural standpoint. We spent, our first episode, we spent a lot of time talking about Zoho's culture. I'm a huge believer in the power of culture. I think one of the strengths of Apple's culture is they manage to turn even their failures into successes, like this as an example, right? Their entire operating model is one of that sort of forward progression, and they are always learning from themselves. And I mean, it's rooted back in Steve Jobs and his entire approach to begin with. I mean, it's a very impressive thing. But talking about failure, as we close out our episode here, I know you wanted to talk about something I don't know that I have all that strong of opinions about, but we talked a lot about all around it, AI and Google and moonshots and F failure. And Google had a pretty high profile failure this week that I know you had some strong feelings about. So maybe we should, we'll wrap up the show by talking a little bit about that.
Oh gosh, yeah. The Google Gemini AI hiccups where they were showing Black Vikings and Asian Nazis and what have you. That I feel like every large language model is making mistakes. Everybody's doing this in real time. Everybody's sending out experiments. I don't really fault any particular vendor for having one particular mistake, because honestly, this is going to happen. And this is going to continue to happen as people are creating more models and more capabilities. But one of the things that really kind of got my goat is one of my pet peeves is that when the Sundar Pichai was apologizing for this, he talked about the challenges of trying to eliminate bias from AI. And to me, that phrase, eliminating bias, is always a warning, because we know that AI is about actually amplifying biases. This is how we create models. We define certain biases, we weight them. There's actually a company out there called Weights and Biases, which all they do is AI models, and they're fantastic at it. But creating AI is about creating biases that match what we are trying to do. It's foundational. Like that is how AI models are created. And anytime you talk about eliminating bias, well, eliminating bias means either making the model smaller or taking away basic assumptions that the model is making. So to me, that's a little bit of a pet peeve, that anybody who's in AI and actually is building AI, and especially is running a company as smart as Google, where we all know it's really hard to get a job at Google because everybody there is smart. Let's just face it. Like, their interview process is hard. Everybody there is top notch at what they do. So if you're talking to these top notch, world class, mostly research scientists and developers, and you're talking about something like eliminating bias, I feel like that's a real issue, because you're spending more time talking to the public and to investors who have a very specific mindset, rather than to the technicians who are actually supposed to be building this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's such a loaded thing, because obviously what he is meaning is the negative bias, right? Bias in and of itself isn't, to your point, it's not a bad thing, right? The brain works off this idea of, we establish those biases that allows us to function, we can process all of that, right? It's an inherently good thing in its true meaning, but of course what he's meaning is the negative biases in some way. The irony is it was caused by their desire, their attempt to tune the model to eliminate the bias in the first place, right? By not automatically generating, everyone being white or whatever. I just assumed personally that they forgot and had the Bridgerton switch turned on. I don't know if you watched the show Bridgerton, but where it's like it reimagines a past where with everything topsy-turvy and whatever, and I think people make such a big to do about all of this, and they're putting so much emphasis, and it's like it's a gotcha game right now around it, and so I sort of discount a lot of it. And it's, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that he shouldn't have responded and reacted. He should have. Google needs to. But to your point, everyone's making mistakes. This is absolutely a rapidly evolving technology, and people need to take it with a big giant grain of salt. But the flip side of it is, if you are a CIO today, you whether you like it or not, you are any step you take down this road, you're stepping into this craziness as well, and so you need to be prepared for those consequences. If whoever you're partnering with, because even if you're not building the models yourself, you're going to be consuming them and potentially putting them out to your customers, and off we go. So it's a very, very interesting time.
Yes, but I think every CIO needs to be very aware that behind any AI decision, there's both the politics, whatever that may be inside your organization and for your clientele, as well as on the other side, there is the challenge of making the model actually cleaner and more accurate at the end of the day. And from a technical perspective, that means adding the biases that are appropriate to your business, your industry, the process that you're working with, the jargon that you use. Every single detail of that is technically a type of bias, but you've got to get those two straight, and you've got to say the right thing to the right people.
And if I can use that as again, I guess this is the show of really rough segues. I'll use this as the
Yeah,
segue to kind of tie all these pieces up, because if I look at all of it, that is what this comes down to me, right? It's about how, if I'm a CIO today, I am looking at the bias towards growth, the bias towards transformation, and the bias away from an overemphasis on the blocking and tackling type technologies that are more likely, just to keep picking on Birmingham, more likely to get you into trouble and to leave you receiving no value for it than those things where you're investing in those things that are going to actually move the ball forward for you. And so, that orientation of how you posture your organization, the bets you're making, the investments you're making, I think are all critical, and all the different things we talked about in various ways today kind of talk to that. So fun times.
excellent. And on that note, that's this week in enterprise tech. As always, like, subscribe, leave your comments below, and we'll be glad to respond to them. Thanks a lot for joining us, and see you next week.